Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So this series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, November 30th, the Battle for Seattle. November 30th, 1999 was set to be a big meeting of the World Trade Organization, with delegates from around the world gathering in Seattle to discuss free trade, globalization, commerce, and neoliberal economic policies, which had been ascendant throughout the 90s. Instead of a wonky and comfortable summit of economic thought leaders, though, these WTO meetings turned into a massive street battle with some 50 to 70,000 protesters hitting the streets, raising the alarm about the economic and environmental impact that they saw from the policies that the WTO was pushing. Streets were blocked, windows were smashed, banners were raised around the city. And at least for a lot of people, I would say, in this country maybe, a new protest movement really did kind of burst onto the scene. But there are so many threads in this that continue to this day. The debate over free trade, economic populism, certainly the nature of street protest and internet-fueled organizing, and also this fascinating thing, which we will get into, about how populism on the left and populism on the right can kind of circle around and meet each other. So tons to discuss with the battle in Seattle. Here to do that, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
Battle for Seattle or Battle in Seattle or Battle of Seattle? I've seen all of these. I don't know.
The important is that the rhyme holds is the most important thing.
That's all that matters.
There's a documentary. I think it's called The Battle in Seattle. So we will call it that. But Niki, let's paint the picture of, as I said, the 1990s ascendant free trade, neoliberal economic policies, and this being the moment at which I think a culmination of the pushback against that, but also the moment at which the pushback against that seemed to just reach out and grab these other simmering issues and bring them all together.
Yeah, so the 1990s, especially with the end of the Cold War, makes space for these pushes on free trade, right? Especially pushed from the United States out into the world, but also coming from places like Europe. You see it in the United States in the early 1990s with the North America Free Trade Agreement. And this is a bipartisan agreement. It is negotiated under George H.W. Bush. It's signed into law under Bill Clinton. Lots of Democrats oppose it. It takes a lot of work by Newt Gingrich in the House to actually whip together enough Republicans to get it passed. So you already see there that the politics are kind of weird, right? Like a Democratic president can't really get these Democratic votes in Congress. It's an intra-party fight that's happening. And this is something that Bill Clinton really wants. You mentioned neoliberal economic policies. He is super on board with globalization. And after he successfully gets NAFTA, he starts eyeing the World Trade Organization as a way of bringing all of these other countries into a free trade organization. And once again, the same groups who were opposing NAFTA are back to fight the World Trade Organization.
And, we've talked on this show about Ross Perot, right? No lefty, but, talking about the giant sucking sound and the sort of economic concerns of what would happen with free trade. So I think we'll circle back to that larger picture of how left and right kind of find common ground, at least policy-wise. In terms of the protests themselves, there had been protests at WTO meetings, at G7 meetings, in Europe and so forth. This is the first time it kind of really felt like it burst onto the scene here in the United States at this summit.
Oh, yeah. I'm also thinking like IMF and the World Bank, major protests. I mean, but this one, I think in particular, I mean, you have tens of thousands, over 50,000 people, maybe even close to 70,000 people. That's a whole town, a decent sized town, descending on Seattle. And I don't think anyone was really prepared for that kind of public activism and what really becomes destructive in a lot of ways. I mean, it causes about $20 million worth of destruction. You're talking about broken windows and trash and, like vandalism. And, this is publicly, I think, looking at the optics of this moment. People just don't know what to make of it because they were so overwhelmed by the numbers and by the grievances. And there's a long list.
Yeah, and that the expectations had been set by, that labor unions had come in and they had applied for permits in order to rally, and environmental groups had done this. So there was this formal permitted march that was happening as all of these groups who were united under the banner of the Direct Action Network are coming together in order to protest. But they're also joined by groups like the Black Bloc anarchist protesters who are more open to and believe that property destruction is a proper way to do these protests. So you have these very traditional groups and these more leftist groups who are coming together and blocking off the streets and really doing, property destruction, but also everyone was committed to this idea of direct action, that you would block the streets, that you would ring the conference center where everyone was going to get together. They end up successfully blocking Madeleine Albright and other world leaders from being able
Kofi Annan.
From being able to meet. They successfully scotched the opening ceremonies of the World Trade Organization meeting because they engage in this direct action.
And that's what really makes public media attention explode, because I think no one would have paid attention to these protests before. Okay, yeah, you've got some angry people out with signs or whatever. But this was so big that everyone had to pay attention. Everyone was airing it on the news channel, what was going on in Seattle.
So big and so ultimately kind of violent, because the protesters are ultimately more or less kettled by the police, and then the police used some pretty brutal tactics in order to fight back against the protesters. So that that captures the evening news and public attention.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, one of the first times, I think, certainly in the U.S., where you can see a script of protests that we're very familiar with now, but these, this massive direct action, breaking windows and property destruction, certainly, and then very militarized police pushback. I think for a lot of people, the battle in Seattle is the first time, you sort of have these images of like police looking like military. In the 90s was when a lot of local police forces sort of got very militarized, and now we saw it in full force. And this was also one of the first places, at least in the U.S., where we kind of got this picture of these various hotbeds of activism across the political spectrum coming together. As we were saying, there was this very interesting confluence here. One group was calling itself Teamsters and Turtles, which is, like old school, deep blue democratic Teamster union organizers with radical lefty environmentalists somehow finding common ground.
Common ground?
Yeah. And I don't think it's a coincidence. Another story that continues to play out today, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is happening in the Pacific Northwest, which is this, it's like this hotbed of activism all across the spectrum. And we can still point to it today and say the political Northwest is where you have, the roots of Antifa in Portland, and you also have the roots of the most sort of white nationalist militarized stuff in Eastern Washington. It's all right there in this sort of part of the country. That stew was very much, I don't know if this would have happened had it not culminated in this geographic part of the world.
I used to live in Washington, in Spokane, which is east of Seattle, about 4 hours east of Seattle. But you do get that sense when you're living in the Pacific Northwest. Seattle is Emerald City. You have this big push for environmentalism and people that care about how we take care of the earth. But you also have, Washington State is also sort of surrounded by Idaho and Oregon and these like very white conservative militant enclaves, and so it makes for a recipe of disaster if you think about something like a big event like this taking place, and how all of these factions come together. I also think it's interesting because, like, you know, for a lot of these protests, they don't get a lot of attention until they become violent. And so it kind of begs the question, like, well, if you want the camera crew here, do I have to break the window in order for the camera crew to show up? Like, it's really quite problematic when you think about it in that way.
I think it's interesting, you know, pulling on those conservative sort of red state enclaves, Eastern Oregon and Idaho. Those are places that actually share with a lot of the leftist protesters a suspicion of the federal government, certainly a suspicion, if not a conspiracism, about one world government, what was called at the time the New World Order, that was at the heart of so many right-wing conspiracies. And so they too were opposed to the World Trade Organization. And the biggest avatar of this at the time, or supporter of this at the time, is Pat Buchanan, who in the early 1990s opposes NAFTA and now is writing columns about how terrible the World Trade Organization is and how important these protests are. And it's such a shift for Buchanan, who in 1968 is watching police officers beat left-wing protesters outside of the Democratic National Convention and is cheering on the police. And now he's seeing these images of left-wing protesters being beaten by police, and he's cheering on the protesters.
But Pat Buchanan's not out there throwing a brick through a McDonald's window, is he?
he is not. He's not
Verbally.
wrapping his arm around a hippie.
But I think that's an important distinction, right? I mean,
It
it's like, who are
is,
the people
absolutely.
on the front lines putting their bodies on the line,
And
who are the
even
people
though
who are picking up that mantle of populism?
Yeah, even though there's this shared ideological thread, it's also not these white nationalist militias who are out there on the front lines of the Seattle protest. This is a largely liberal left-wing protest. And even though there's common cause that's going to be made with the right around some of these issues in Congress and in the opinion pages of national newspapers, when it comes to the battle for Seattle, that's a liberal left movement.
Yeah. Though, of course, you know, I mean, obviously, Pat Buchanan's roots with Donald Trump, and you could see a lot of the way that Donald Trump talked about jobs and say a lot of this language, if he had sort of articulated it coherently, which he's incapable of doing, but if he had done so, it would have been like, wow, this is something that feels like what a union organizer would have said in the mid-70s into the mid-90s. And so, yes, you see how all those languages and all that suspicion of globalization bleeds into each other. So let's come back to the protests themselves and the sort of tactical protests and the response on the ground. You know, I keep coming back to the militarized response. We saw the sort of rise of stuff like kettling, and we saw, you know, these phalanxes of police marching forward and breaking people up and creating these sort of, quote, free speech zones and trying to sort of push protests off. And, you know, this is all stuff that then as you get into the 2000s, you think about the 2004 convention in New York City, and then even through to the Black Lives Matter protests of this last year or so, you see a lot of these tactics emerge. What else about the actual on-the-ground protests strikes either of you?
I mean, the Seattle mayor, Paul Schell, declares a state of emergency. He imposes a curfew. He puts a 50-block no protest zone up and puts those, you know, restrictions in place that are like highly guarded. Some of these tactics, again, we still see, you know, today with curfews and with these protest zones where their protesters have to be like 5 miles outside the city or something, so that they're almost rendered ineffective because, you know, they're not in proximity to the actual meeting place that they're trying to protest. But yeah, there is an attempt to create law and order, as they say, and it kind of devolves into that.
I think it's important that we trace this back to what's happening in Seattle, and that, Jody, you've been talking about the militarization of policing in the 1990s. This is all a product of the end of the Cold War. And when we talk about it today, we often talk about it as being caused by the war on terror. And certainly that beefs a lot of these actions up, actions against protesters. It gives the state more powers to restrict free speech and these protest rallies, but it's happening in the 1990s. It's already there. It's already unfolding. And so you see local and state police learning these tactics. You also see the protesters learning these tactics. These tactics that are used in Seattle they're still used by protesters today because they saw what they were doing in Seattle as pretty effective. They get all of this news coverage. They get the anti-globalization movement in the news. They shut down the opening ceremonies. Even though there is this big pushback and this real restriction that happens, this is a big success for the folks battling in Seattle.
And the delegations, I mean, most of the stuff that they were supposed to vote on, they can't get consensus on because of the protest. And so they pretty much leave the conference with a lot of things unresolved.
Yeah.
I think that's so important, Kellie, that this has an actual effect on policy. And it has this way of uniting. I mean, we've talked about uniting left and right in the United States, but anti-globalization protesters across the world. There was this very famous French farmer who had bulldozed a McDonald's in protest of free trade agreement and in protest of something called GATT, which was this agreement on tariffs and treaties. And he's there in Seattle. It's this very potent symbol of the international alliance behind this.
One other note on the tactics. I mentioned it in the intro, but I don't think we can view this moment and not talk about obviously the rise of the internet and the internet organizing that goes into this. And this is early, relatively early days, but we have listservs and message boards. And I think again, just that ability to be a little more agile in terms of organizing in real time, and B, also I think that internet organizing greases the wheels, or it can grease the wheels for interesting coalitions, because it's no longer about, well, I have to find my local chapter of whatever group and I have to go and show up or subscribe to the news. It's like I can wander around on the internet and one idea can morph into another, and all of a sudden, I'm an anarchist and I'm talking with a farmer or whatever. And I do think
the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right, exactly. And it's just easier to make those connections online. And certainly as you look at protest movements into the 2000s into today, so much of it is about internet organizing. And we've talked about it on this show that, I don't think Occupy sort of sits in the public imagination in the story of the last 20 years with the prominence that it should. Occupy is a big part of the roots of where we are now, and I think a big part of the roots of Occupy are these WTO protests, both in terms of tactics and in terms of trying to find this common cause among different groups.
And notably, I think that they were mocked in the press the same way. I mean, certainly the activists saw both of those as successes, both the battle in Seattle and Occupy. But in the press, they were often parodied, right? The turtles of the WTO protests, and this idea that Occupy was listless and aimless, but that they really laid roots for a lot of movements to come.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a much bigger story there, I think, about how the simmering anger about globalization was dismissed throughout the 2000s, and then we saw in the 2010s how it just came bursting back onto the scene. But I think people, part of it was because the Iraq War and questions about that took over and so forth. But I think that these were dismissed as like people running around in the streets, and then all of a sudden we saw it rear its head as a genuine sort of source of anger and a genuine issue in the last couple election
But I think that the media always maligns activists. You know what I mean? From the left or the right. Like, they're always seen parodied or seen as over the top or extra in this way. It's not often that you see civil rights activists getting a fair shake with the media. They're always seen as a nuisance.
Very fair.
But as Niki has written about and talked about so much on the show, like, there has now been a media ecosystem that can continue to stoke that fire. And so as much as genteel, establishment media wants to diminish these concerns, it was there all along, and now it's come bursting back. All right, let's leave it there. I'm sure we will circle around on this and certainly on these issues many more times. But that was great. And I want to say thank you to a number of listeners who have written in and said that we should do the battle in Seattle. So thank you for that. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you as always.
My pleasure.
You've got people here from all over. You got labor, you got environmentalists, you got teachers, you've got children, you've got coalitions between people of color and mainstream white Americans. You've got middle class, you got working poor, you got poor. You got everybody out here because this hurts people.
I mean, we had been shot at, we had been gassed, people had been beaten and shot. People didn't expect that going into Tuesday, and people had to recommit themselves and reaffirm their position.
Radiotopia.
From PRX.